If you walked into a courthouse today, waited for a trial to conclude, and then stood up right as the judge was reading the verdict for a convicted bank robber, you would get a lot of strange looks.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the bailiff would probably be eyeing you right away, wondering what you were doing.
Right. But imagine if you went a step further. Like, imagine if you walked up to the bench and said, Your Honor, I know this man robbed the bank.
Yeah, that would be quite the scene.
You say, I know he is guilty, but I am totally innocent, and I would like to volunteer to go to a federal penitentiary for 10 years so that he can go free.
The judge would probably laugh you right out of the room.
For sure. It would be rejected out of hand. And the reason is, well, in our legal system, an innocent person cannot just absorb a guilty person's sentence.
No, the state demands accountability from the actual person who committed the crime. It is a strictly mathematical one-to-one ratio.
Yeah, but here's the thing. The entire concept of Christian salvation rests on what looks, on the surface, like this specific legal loophole.
It really does look like that to the modern eye.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are taking a deep dive into the historical and theological mechanics of substitutionary atonement.
And we are using a really fantastic source for this.
We are. Today we are looking at a specific section of a 17th century text called The Glory of Christ by John Owen.
Which is just an incredible piece of writing.
It really is. Our mission here is to unpack a very specific, high-stakes theological and legal question for you.
How can it possibly be fair, or just for an innocent person to suffer the punishment meant for someone else?
Yes, because if it does not work in a modern courtroom, how does it work in the courtroom of divine justice? Have you ever felt that logical disconnect?
I think a lot of people have, honestly. It sounds great in a hymn, but logically it is tough.
To help decipher this massive 17th century framework, I am joined by a resident expert.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to getting into this.
We're going to look at what Owen calls the intimate conjunction or union between Christ and the church.
Right. He breaks this down into 3 distinct types of conjunction that make this translation of punishment legally and morally sound.
So let's just jump right in. It is a remarkable legal framework that Owen builds.
To understand the brilliance of what he is doing, we have to recognize that, well, we like our laws to be clean.
Yeah, categorized and visibly fair to the human eye.
Precisely. When you introduce the idea of a substitute taking the fall for a guilty party, human logic immediately hits a wall.
The secular judge in that opening analogy would simply say, the law demands the offender, not a volunteer.
John Owen knew this. He was writing in the 17th century, a time of massive political and legal upheaval in England.
He recognized that if God is going to be the absolute moral governor of the universe, his legal proceedings have to be ironclad.
They cannot feature arbitrary loopholes. God does not operate on technicalities.
So Owen sets out to prove that the translation of punishment from the guilty to the innocent is not a violation of justice.
But there is a condition. It is only just provided there is a specific multi-layered union between the two parties.
Let us move from that modern courtroom analogy straight into the historical objection that Owen was fighting against in his own day.
That is a great place to start.
Set the stage for us. Before we can talk about the solution, what is the core problem that makes this translation of punishment so necessary in the first place?
The core problem really begins with the fall of mankind and the resulting curse.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Owen lays out the grim reality that all the elect, the whole church of God, fell in Adam. They fell under the curse of the law due to transgression.
And this is not a minor infraction like a parking ticket.
No, not at all. This specific curse contains both temporal and eternal death.
We have to look at the character of God here.
Absolutely. God is entirely holy, and he is entirely true to his word.
Because of that absolute holiness and truth, sin cannot simply be swept under the rug.
The law was broken, and the law has a consequence attached to it by the creator of the universe.
Therefore, if God is going to save his church, there is a strict necessity for a translation of punishment.
The penalty must be moved from those who deserved it but could not bear it to one who did not deserve it but was fully capable of bearing the infinite weight of it.
Because God cannot just pretend the crime did not happen.
Right. God is a just judge. He cannot ignore the law he established.
This brings us to the critics of Owen's day, and I think their objection is fascinating because it sounds, well, incredibly modern.
It really does. Owen specifically mentions critics like Socinus.
For our listeners who might not know, Socinus was an influential thinker whose followers basically built a hyper-rationalistic system.
Yeah, they relied heavily on human reason to dictate theology.
They argued against the Trinity and against substitutionary atonement because it did not fit neatly into human logic.
Their core argument against the cross was that Christ was just a man,
They said he was at the greatest possible distance from other men.
meaning he was an individual, separate human being, just like you or me.
Their logic is that without a pre-existing structural connection, transferring the guilt of millions of people to this one isolated guy in the first century is completely arbitrary.
And in their view, totally unjust.
That is a highly potent objection, and it still echoes today.
It does. It appeals directly to our basic human sense of fairness.
When you read verses like 1 Peter 2.24, where it says, "In his own self he bears our sins in his own body on the tree."
Or 1 Peter 3.18, where it says, "The just suffers for the unjust."
It seems, as Owen admits, strange to reason.
The Socinians asked a very fair question. They asked, where is the equity?
If God just grabbed a random, unconnected bystander off the streets of Jerusalem and laid the iniquity of the world on him, it would violate God's own divine justice.
It would look like cosmic abuse, honestly.
A just God cannot punish a totally unrelated, innocent bystander.
That is the hurdle Owen is trying to clear. He has to prove the connection.
I want to push back on this with an analogy just to make the critic's point as sharp as possible.
Go for it.
If I am driving down the highway, going 90 miles an hour in a 45 zone, and I blow through a red light, causing a massive multi-car accident.
You are definitely going to jail for that.
Yeah, the police are going to hand me a severe citation, or more likely put me in handcuffs.
The state demands your accountability.
Right. My neighbor, who was sitting quietly in his living room reading a book 3 towns over, cannot walk out, hand the arresting officer his credit card and say, "I will pay his fines, and I will take his prison time."
The officer would look at him like he was crazy.
The neighbor has absolutely no legal standing in my infraction. He is a separate entity.
So how does Owen defend God's legal integrity against this kind of airtight, common-sense logic?
Yeah, what is his response?
Owen defends it by pointing out what happens if we get this wrong. We have to look at the massive stakes involved.
Okay, what are the stakes?
If we view salvation as God simply ignoring the law or waving a magic wand and deciding the law no longer applies, we lose the entirety of divine justice.
We have to look at God's historical track record as the moral governor of the universe.
God did not spare the angels who sinned. He cast them down.
And God did not spare Adam at the first transgression. He cast him out of paradise.
Right. So if God's justice acted with such severe precision in the eternal punishment of fallen angels, what becomes of his justice if he dismisses guilty humans unpunished?
If God just lets the highway speeder go free without any legal satisfaction, he ceases to be a just judge.
It would not harmonize with his nature. God cannot deny himself.
Therefore, the law must be satisfied, but it must be satisfied in a way that is actually legal.
Precisely. It cannot be a legal fiction.
Okay, so to understand how God solves this massive legal puzzle without violating his own character, we first have to look at how God has historically applied shared consequences.
This is where things get a bit uncomfortable for modern readers.
Yeah, Owen does not just jump straight into the New Testament to explain the cross.
He takes us through Old Testament precedents to prove that translating punishment from one person to another is not completely unheard of in divine justice.
Right. Owen provides a series of historical evidences where God has done this exact kind of translation.
He starts with the second commandment in Exodus 20.5.
Where God says he visits the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation.
He brings up the Babylonish captivity, pointing out that God punished the nation of Israel for the sins of their forefathers.
Specifically, the horrific idolatry and bloodshed committed during the reign of King Manasseh, long after Manasseh was dead.
He also mentions Canaan being cursed for the sin of his father Ham right after the flood.
And then you have the story of King Saul's 7 sons being put to death for their father's bloody cruelty toward the Gibeonites.
But the instance that is perhaps the most jarring, the one that really stops you in your tracks, is the story of David taking a census.
For the sin of David numbering his troops, 70,000 Israelites were destroyed by a plague.
David even cries out in the text, he says, "It is I that have sinned and done evil. These sheep, what have they done?"
David himself is pointing out the apparent logical disconnect.
Those examples are incredibly difficult for the modern individualistic mind to process.
We are conditioned to think only in terms of strict individual autonomy.
But Owen uses these difficult texts to establish a crucial, undeniable point about the mechanics of divine justice.
This administration of shared consequences is not promiscuous. It is not random.
Right. God does not just punish anyone for the sins of anyone else.
Owen provides strict criteria for when this happens. Two specific things are required for shared punishment to be considered just.
First, there must be a special relation. The individuals involved must constitute what Owen calls one body.
Like a parent and a child, or a king and his subjects, they are not disconnected strangers.
Look, reading about 70,000 people dying because a king decided to count his troops is incredibly hard to stomach today.
It really is. How does Owen defend that as just?
Well, when I try to wrap my head around it, the only thing that comes close in our modern world is corporate liability.
Oh, that is a good analogy.
Imagine the CEO of a massive, publicly traded company. He commits egregious financial fraud, cooks the books, hides massive debts, and eventually ruins the company.
He's the one who committed the crime. He signed the fraudulent papers.
But who suffers the consequences? The shareholders lose their entire life savings overnight.
The factory workers, who had absolutely nothing to do with the accounting fraud, lose their pensions and their jobs.
They suffer severe financial ruin because they are tied to the same corporate body as the CEO.
The CEO's actions, legally and practically, cascade down to everyone under his headship.
As Owen brilliantly puts it, the back answers for what the hand takes away.
The hand stole, but the back gets the whip.
That corporate liability analogy is incredibly helpful. The king and the people are one political body, just like the CEO and the employees are one corporate body.
The head acts on behalf of the whole. That is the first requirement, a special relation.
The second requirement Owen outlines is a special mutual interest.
This means the suffering of one party must be an active punishment to the other party.
Take the example of parents and children. When we look at Numbers 14, God is dealing with the rebellious Israelites who refuse to enter the promised land.
God threatens them by saying their children will wander in the wilderness for 40 years and bear their whoredoms.
If you stop and think about the psychological weight of that, the sting of the punishment was actually felt most acutely by the parents.
That is a staggering thought. The kids are wandering, but the parents are the ones agonizing over it.
Precisely. Watching your children suffer in a barren, dangerous wasteland, knowing full well that they are eating manna and living in tents solely because of your own rebellion.
It is a severe, crushing punishment upon you.
The punishment is transferred geographically and physically to the children, but the penalty still strikes the original offender squarely in the heart through that mutual interest.
The connection makes the punishment valid in the eyes of justice.
So, if earthly relations, like a king and his subjects or parents and their children, can legally and morally justify shared consequences in the eyes of God,
then the relationship between Christ and the church must be unimaginably tighter to justify an eternal substitution.
the earthly examples are just shadows.
That brings us to the core of Owen's argument. He breaks down this connection into three specific ties. Let us start with the first one, the natural conjunction.
The natural conjunction is the absolute baseline requirement.
Owen roots this idea in Acts 17.26, which states that God made all mankind of one blood.
There is a natural alliance, a shared biological and ontological reality between all human beings. We share the same nature.
Christ entered into this natural alliance by taking on flesh and blood.
The writer of Hebrews points this out in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15.
He says that because the children are partakers of flesh and blood, Christ also himself likewise took part of the same.
He had to become what we are.
But Owen makes a massive fundamental distinction here between our natural state and Christ's natural state.
This is where the legal argument starts to get really tight.
We are born into the human race out of strict necessity. You and I had absolutely no choice in being human.
No, we did not select our parents, we did not pick our century, and we did not choose our species. We were just born.
Christ, however, entered this natural conjunction via a completely voluntary act of his will. He pre-existed his human birth.
That voluntary act is the absolute linchpin of Owen's legal defense.
Natural generation prevents all acts of our own choice. You cannot consent to your own conception.
But Christ, existing eternally as the Son of God prior to his incarnation, actively chose to partake of flesh and blood.
He chose to step down into this communion of nature. He willed to become what the children were.
He was not trapped by biology. He assumed biology.
The way I picture this is the difference between being drafted into a military conflict and voluntarily enlisting.
That makes a lot of sense.
If I'm drafted by necessity, I receive a letter in the mail, and I am forced by the government to participate. I have no choice in the matter.
Right, you just have to go.
But if I'm a civilian sitting at home in perfect safety, and I voluntarily enlist, signing the papers to take a highly dangerous mission specifically to save a trapped unit behind enemy lines.
Your participation is in a completely different legal and moral category.
Christ enlisted. He was not drafted.
He enlisted for a highly specific, targeted mission.
Owen unpacks the exact purpose of this choice, and this refutes the critics entirely.
Christ became human for the exclusive end of doing and suffering what was required for the church.
The text in Hebrews explicitly says, "He partook of flesh and blood, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death."
Because it was a completely unique, purposeful insertion into human nature, critics like the Socinians cannot argue it operates by the same restrictive rules as regular human relationships.
He did not become human to establish a carpentry business or to build a political empire.
Or just to live a normal 80-year lifespan and die peacefully.
His exclusive end, the entire reason he took on a physical body, was substitution.
He took on a body so that he would have something to offer on the cross.
Just being human is not enough to save us, though. A natural tie is the baseline.
It makes him capable of dying because a spirit cannot bleed, but it does not give him the legal right to represent a specific, targeted group of people.
I can be human, but that does not mean I can pay your speeding ticket.
That is where the second tie comes in, and this is where the connection becomes profoundly intimate. Well, I should say extremely intimate and exclusive.
We are moving from the biological to the relational. Let us unpack the mystical conjunction.
The mystical conjunction is the moral and real union between Christ and the church.
To explain this, the scriptures use highly vivid, organic analogies.
The text describes this union as the connection between a head and its members, the vine and its branches, or a husband and a wife.
Ephesians 5 is a prime example of this. Paul commands husbands to love their wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it.
Because Christ is the head and the husband, it is legally righteous that what he suffered is imputed or credited to the church.
A husband covered the debts of his wife.
But wait, here is the most fascinating logical hurdle in the entire text, and it is a massive timing objection.
Yes, this is a huge point.
How can Christ be united to the church on the cross if the church consists of unregenerate unbelievers at that exact moment in history?
We know from Romans 5 that Christ died for the ungodly.
We are not actually grafted into the vine until we believe, which for most of us happened 2,000 years after the crucifixion.
So how could a mystical union, a marriage, exist before we were even born, let alone before we had faith?
How is he paying for a bride that does not exist yet?
Owen answers this brilliant timing objection with two main defenses, pulling us back into the eternal perspective of God.
First, he argues that the church was designed in the counsel of God to be Christ's spouse prior to his sufferings.
This was an eternal blueprint.
Second, there was a supreme act of God the Father giving the elect to the Son prior to the actual work of redemption.
You see Jesus referencing this multiple times in his high priestly prayer in John 17.
Saying things like, "Thine they were, and thou gavest them me."
The mystical union has its virtue and legal efficacy in the courtroom of heaven before it is actually consummated in the life of the individual believer in real time.
Owen uses a brilliant reference to the Old Testament to illustrate this concept of working for a future bride.
He points us to Hosea 12:12, where it talks about Israel, or Jacob, serving for a wife.
If we go back to Genesis, Jacob worked for his uncle Laban for 7 long, grueling years to earn the right to marry Rachel.
During those 7 years of hard labor out in the scorching fields, she was already considered his wife in design and purpose.
Even though the marriage had not been consummated and the ceremony had not happened.
His labor, his sweat, and his suffering were explicitly for her.
He was not just farming for the sake of farming. He was working for a specific bride.
Christ labored on the cross for a bride that was already his by divine design.
Consider the immense security this offers you, the listener.
If your mystical union with Christ only began the moment you drummed up enough personal faith, it would be a highly fragile union.
It would depend entirely on your emotional state or your intellectual grasp of theology on any given Tuesday.
But Owen is showing us that this union was established in the eternal counsel of God before the cross ever happened.
Before the universe was even spoken into existence.
Christ did not go to the cross merely just hoping a random assortment of people might eventually choose to marry him.
He did not die for a hypothetical bride.
He went to the cross sweating and suffering for a specific, designated bride that had already been promised and given to him by the Father.
The labor was targeted.
I love that. While the mystical union secures the relational aspect, the husband and the wife, the head and the body, there still needs to be an ironclad legal contract.
Right, to satisfy the strict courtroom of divine justice we talked about at the beginning.
Love and biology are great, but the judge still needs a legal document.
That brings us to the third and final tie, the federal conjunction.
The federal conjunction happens by mutual compact.
To clarify the terminology here, when Owen uses the word federal, he is not talking about a central government like we do today.
He is using the older theological meaning rooted in the Latin word fetus.
Which means a covenant, a treaty, or a binding legal contract.
This federal tie is where one person legally undertakes to be a sponsor or a surety for others,
Taking on the legal obligation to answer for what is required of them.
Owen points directly to Hebrews 7:22, which calls Jesus the surety of a better covenant.
Christ legally tendered himself to God the Father to do and suffer whatever was required for the church.
He signed his name on the dotted line.
This completes the trifecta perfectly.
The natural union makes him capable of dying because he has actual flesh and blood.
The mystical union makes him the rightful, relational representative of the specific people, the bride.
And the federal union makes the transfer of guilt an official contractual reality recognized by the judge.
Let me put this in financial terms to make it crystal clear.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
If I default on a massive multi-million-dollar commercial mortgage, the bank does not care if a random person off the street walks into the lobby and offers a sad story about how much they love me.
The bank operates on legally binding contracts, not emotions.
But if someone explicitly signed as my guarantor or surety on the original loan document before the money was ever handed out,
The bank legally must accept their payment. It is not a loophole. It is the terms of the contract.
Christ signed the contract. He is the official guarantor.
By combining all three of these conjunctions, natural, mystical, and federal, Owen completely dismantles the Socinian critics' argument.
Christ is not a random man standing at the greatest possible distance from other men.
He is intimately, legally, biologically, and relationally tied to his people in a way that makes the transfer of punishment mathematically and morally perfect.
The judge does not reject the volunteer because the volunteer is actually the legal guarantor of the broken party.
Now that we have worked through the mechanics of this threefold union, we have to look at the grand effect.
What is the ultimate result of this intimate conjunction on the character of God?
We started this deep dive talking about the tension between strict justice and the desire to save.
How does this framework resolve that tension?
The grand effect is the total harmonization of justice and mercy.
It results in the absolute exaltation of God's righteousness in the very act of forgiving sins.
As we established earlier, human logic naturally assumes God must choose between two mutually exclusive identities.
Either he must be a strict, inflexible judge who condemns everyone according to the precise letter of the law,
Or he must be a lenient, loving grandfather who simply ignores the law, sweeps sin under the rug, and lets everyone off the hook.
Human reason says you cannot have both.
And that perceived contradiction is what causes so many people to, as Owen says, stumble and fall eternally.
They cannot reconcile a God of terrifying wrath with a God of infinite love. It feels like cognitive dissonance to them.
Yes, but because of Christ's substitution through this threefold union, God does not have to compromise either attribute.
He does not diminish his wrath to sure love, and he does not withhold his love to execute wrath.
He exercises vindictive justice on the cross, punishing sin with absolute, unmitigated severity, and he extends maximum grace to the sinner simultaneously.
The apparent contradiction is completely removed.
Justice is served, and the criminal is pardoned, all in one stroke.
Owen quotes Justin Martyr in the text, and it is such a striking, beautiful phrase. He says, "Oh, blessed change. Oh, sweet permutation."
Think about that word, permutation. In mathematics, a permutation is an arrangement of items in a specific order.
In older legal terms, it is a complete swapping of properties or goods.
It is the mathematical and legal swapping of our massive debt and guilt for his absolute innocence and righteousness.
It is not just that our debt is wiped to zero. His positive righteousness is swapped into our account.
The psychological relief this brings to a convinced sinner is staggering.
When your conscience is terrified by your own guilt, when you are lying awake at night knowing you have broken the law and genuinely deserve the penalty,
The only thing that can give your soul actual rest and composure is seeing that God is eternally well pleased.
his justice is not waiting around the corner to strike you when you mess up again. It has already been entirely exhausted and satisfied on the cross.
The wrath has been spent.
That brings us to the final theological effect Owen discusses, which is the perfect fulfillment of the law.
The law given by God on Mount Sinai could not be broken without consequence, and it could not be ignored. It had to be accomplished.
Through this intimate union we have been discussing, the law was fulfilled in us by being fulfilled for us.
This is the sheer brilliance of the divine dynamic. God's wisdom in giving the law in the first place is exalted.
The law actually achieves its complete intended purpose through the perfect, spotless obedience of Christ.
We do not bypass the law to get into heaven. We meet its absolute rigorous standard through our federal head.
We pass the test because he passed the test, and we are tied to him.
Let me put this in perspective for anyone listening who feels weighed down by their own failures.
When you feel like you are constantly falling short of the standard, when you look at your daily actions, your thoughts, your habits, and you see failure after failure,
This doctrine tells you that legally, in the courtroom of heaven, your grade card reads 100%.
the obedience was completed by your surety.
And because of your natural, mystical, and federal union with him, that perfect score is permanently recorded under your name in the ledger.
That is why grasping this framework is meant to be a massive anchor for doubting souls.
It keeps you firm and steadfast in all the trials and storms of life.
Your standing before God is not based on your fluctuating daily performance, your emotional highs, or your moral failures.
It is based on a threefold union that was designed in eternity past, ratified by blood, and upheld by divine justice.
We have covered a massive amount of theological ground today.
We looked at the natural conjunction where Christ took on flesh and blood by a completely voluntary act of his will, stepping down to become what we are.
We looked at the mystical conjunction, where he became the head and husband of a specific bride given to him by the Father before time began.
And we looked at the federal conjunction where he signed the covenant contract as our legal surety.
Together, these three ties solve the greatest legal problem in the universe.
They turn what seems strange and contradictory to human reason into a masterpiece of divine equity.
It is a framework that rigorously defends the absolute terrifying holiness of God while simultaneously providing unbreakable, eternal comfort for the individual believer.
I want to leave you with a closing thought to mull over as you go about your week.
If your legal standing and your spiritual life are this permanently grafted into Christ through a union designed before the universe was even formed, how does that alter the way you look at your own isolation today?
If you are a member of this cosmic, legally bound body, intricately tied to a victorious head, is it even possible for you to ever truly be alone or entirely responsible for your own ultimate failure?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking.